Even if you're not into the fantasy aesthetic, or shooters in general, Immortals of Aveum is still a very interesting title. The game uses Unreal Engine 5.1 and is the first AAA title to simultaneously take advantage of several signature features in order to bring its world to life. Alex will take a closer look at the tech in a separate video. In the meantime, I'm here to relay my findings regarding the game's performance on PC. When the game's system requirements first dropped, they definitely raised some eyebrows. The minimum spec calls for an RTX 2080 Super, an 8-core CPU, and strongly recommends an SSD. Of course, system requirements aren't always accurate, and don't always give an idea of the level of performance one can expect. Thankfully, Immortals of Aveum bucks this trend by providing target resolutions and frame rates alongside those recommended specs. That theoretical minimum spec PC? Well, they say it's only good enough for 1080p 60. The recommended specs are even more jaw-dropping, with a 3080 Ti and a 5700X apparently only being good enough for 1440p 60. And these are all assuming you're using DLSS or FSR. Now, given what we've seen of Unreal Engine 5's performance in real-time demos in the past, the high specs do seem to make some sense, but when not viewed through that lens, they are undeniably high. For some perspective, let's take a look at the Steam hardware survey from July of 2023. Here we can see that nearly 60% of PCs used CPUs with either 4 or 6 cores, and the most popular GPUs don't measure up to a 2080 Super. Needless to say, one should expect Immortals of Aveum to be one of the most demanding games to date, but I wanted to know just how accurate those recommended specs are. And seeing as how I have 3 machines that are pretty close to the suggested 1080p, 1440p, and 4K builds, I thought I'd put the game to the test on each and find out for myself. Right off the bat, I was pleasantly surprised to see you can skip all the logos. Heading into the menu reveals a number of other positive aspects and a few negatives. For example, unlike in the console version, you can adjust your FOV, but the slider only goes up to 90 degrees, which is a bit of a bummer if you're like me and prefer a much wider FOV for shooters. There are a number of accessibility and graphics options to tweak, but sadly, there are no descriptions or preview images to give an idea of how each graphics setting affects the presentation. Also, and this is a big negative for me, certain options like texture quality require a complete restart of the whole game to take effect, which makes tweaking needlessly time-consuming and tedious. On the whole, I'd say the menu is serviceable, but a few key changes would make a world of difference. And in addition to all this, those of you with ultra-wide monitors will be pleased to know the game natively supports those resolutions and resizes the HUD accordingly during gameplay. Then there is the performance budget tool that the developer's touting, meant to help you match the right settings with your specific hardware. The general idea is that the game surveys your machine and assigns your GPU and CPU a total number of points, and each setting uses up a certain number of those points. Go over the total, and your performance will suffer. The whole thing is nice in theory, but during my time with this game, it didn't seem to really be working correctly, as the one graphical option with the highest point total was anisotropic filtering, and after doing some testing even at 16x, it unsurprisingly doesn't really impact the frame rate. Moving on to performance then, let's look at the game on a high-end machine first. Using a PC with specs similar to the recommended 4K 60 build, an RTX 4080 and an Intel i7-13700K, I found that I was able to max out all settings and stay around or above 60 FPS during the vast majority of gameplay. Surprisingly though, DLSS quality wasn't quite low enough in some scenarios, and I still saw drops below 60 in large areas with numerous characters on screen. Indeed, I had to drop down to DLSS performance to iron things out completely. It's important to note that frame generation is included for 40 series owners as well, and it does provide a nice frame rate boost from my testing. However, even after the game's first patch, it causes this ghosting effect on the HUD, making it practically unusable. Fortunately, DLSS Super Resolution gave me enough of a boost on its own in performance mode, and the image quality was still pretty good. Not everything was perfect though, as I did still notice some instances of distracting pop-in and a few stutters here and there. The stuttering is thankfully not due to shader compilation though. As you can see here, the game runs identically both off a fresh driver install and on a second run. Instead, this stuttering is tied to traversal and to certain events, such as this communicator globe popping up. Luckily, I didn't experience much stuttering in the middle of any crucial gameplay moments, so while it is present, it doesn't seem to be too disruptive on this level of hardware. Overall, the suggested specs for a 4K 60 experience seem to be decently accurate. If they fix DLSS 3, that would make a big difference. Also, regarding upscaling technology, the game also offers FSR 2, and comparisons reveal that DLSS is still pretty much identical to native, but FSR is, for some reason, even more detailed, leading me to think it either has a different LOD bias, or maybe a sharpening filter, or both, but it's interesting. Where DLSS may be lacking in detail though, it more than makes up for it in stability. Comparing the two in motion, DLSS does a better job, particularly with fast-moving objects. As you can see, with quick animations like swapping weapons, FSR becomes sort of a mess. And that is with both set to quality. Set to performance, FSR becomes practically unusable. Moving down to a PC closely aligned with the recommended spec for a 1440p 60, I largely saw more of the same. With an RTX 3080 Ti and an R9 5900X, I managed to stay at or above 60 FPS practically the entire time with a mix of high and ultra settings and DLSS set to quality. Again, I experienced some minor hitching here and there, but nothing really significant in any of the footage I captured. All in all, like the recommended specs for 4K 60, these also seem to be pretty spot on. Now let's look at a machine closer to the minimum requirements. For this, I used my mid-range rig with an R5 3600 and an RTX 2080, specs that are actually a touch below the minimum system requirements. Still, given that we know this rig lines up decently with the consoles because of comparisons done in other games, we might be able to get some idea of what to expect by looking at how the console versions perform first. Since I happen to have access to the PS5 version, I decided to use that one for comparison. As Tom pointed out in his video, the PS5 version runs at an internal resolution of 720p while targeting 60 FPS. And we know from testing that the game drops below 60 FPS in open areas like this one. And we see similar results at 1080p with DLSS set to quality on this machine. Out of sheer curiosity, I did try to figure out what settings the PS5 version is using. Textures appear to be at ultra, and global illumination appears to be a match for high. Everything pertaining to shadows appears to be mostly equal to high, and reflections seem to be closer to low than high. Unfortunately, I found other settings to be difficult to pinpoint. Foliage, for example, has the thickness of the higher settings on PC in the foreground, but the distance at which trees render isn't as far. Back to the mid-range PC though. The limiting factor on this hardware seems to be that the game is heavily CPU bound, as even with the lowest possible settings, the frame rate constantly dips as low as the 40s, all while the GPU is sitting well below 100% utilization. One issue that was noticeably worse no matter what settings I used was traversal stutter. As far as determining any optimized settings, the truth is they don't really make much sense on the mid-range PC, since even the lowest settings can't hold 60 FPS. With that in mind then, I took a bit of time and went through each setting on my 4080 instead, and I saw only 3 settings have any notable impact on performance: global illumination, shadow resolution quality, and shadow rendering pool size. Changing these 3 from ultra to high gave me around a 10% boost without losing a ton of visual fidelity. Before wrapping up, out of curiosity, I decided to see how the game fares on hardware more in line with what we saw on the Steam survey earlier. So I broke out my old PC equipped with a GTX 1080 and a quad-core Intel 7700K. What I found was interesting. At 1080p with FSR set to quality and everything set to low except textures, which were at high, the game actually remained above 30 FPS in some pretty demanding areas, at least until I walked through some trees and the frame rate tanked to the low 20s. So the game seems to still be playable on hardware well below minimum spec, but you will be stuck with the lowest settings and 30 to 40 FPS at best. Again, capping things at 30 FPS for more consistency may be the best option here, but poor frame pacing will still be an issue. In summary, the high system requirements for Immortals of Aveum are absolutely for real. It is an incredibly heavy game that requires an above-average PC to come even close to maintaining the developer's intended 60 FPS experience. On the upside, the system requirements actually provide a decently accurate assessment of what you can expect from a raw performance standpoint. On the downside, a few outstanding issues like traversal stutter keep it from reaching its full potential. Here's hoping the developers are able to fix these issues in future patches, unlike some other games recently published by EA. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and don't forget to ring the bell to receive instant notifications whenever a new one drops. For a pristine version of this and every video we make, check out the Digital Foundry Patreon at patreon.com. And if you'd like to get in touch directly, just use X. Till next time.